Hello, everyone. Welcome to pilgriminNarnia.com. I'm Brenton Dickinson. I don't know where you first saw it. It might have been in traffic, a little Jesus fish, or it might have been watching Fox and seeing a commentator on TV, someone like Reza Aslan, or it could have been in a church, could have been in a painting. But Jesus is certainly a fascinating figure. Not only is he one of the most important people who ever lived as far as history goes, but he is also the center of Christianity, the person of God who comes in flesh to engage with the world. And this Jesus we hear about is actually told to us mostly in the Bible, in the New Testament especially. And I wanted to do a brief introduction to the New Testament. Now, the New Testament is actually not just one book. It's a series of 27 books. I'm staying here in a hotel. I have a family member at a hospital in another city. It's a very generic hotel with bad art and bad lighting and pretty much bad in all kinds of ways. But of course, when you lean over to the bedside table and you open up the top drawer, you might find something like this. Okay, this is a Bible here. It's placed there by the Gideons. There's millions of these Bibles in hotels' rooms across the world, placed by people like the Gideons, a fellowship of men and women who place Bibles in hotels and hospitals and places like that. There's also the United Bible Society has them, and in some hotels throughout the world you'll find other scriptures as well, like the Quran in different parts, or sometimes some Buddhist scriptures. And so when you open up a Bible, now I often use a Bible app on my phone, and there's a lot of different apps that you can get, and most of those are free or easily accessible. When you open up a physical Bible, you're going to find in the table of contents that there's 27 books that are in the New Testament, 66 books in most Bibles. In Catholic Bibles, you're going to find a few more that are part of the Old Testament world, but 27 books in the New Testament in most Bibles. Now, those books are made up of basically three different kinds of books. There's history books, there's letters, and there's something called Apocalypse, which is probably a little bit new. We know about history. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are very much like some of our Old Testament books like Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, or 1st and 2nd Kings. And they give a sense of who Jesus was in his world. They're a little bit different, and they're written, as all the New Testament is, in Greek, and so not actually in the language that Jesus spoke. Those four Gospels have continued through history to be read and placed in the order that they're placed. Right after those four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is the book of Acts, which is the closest thing we have to an ancient history book. Written by the same person who wrote the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, gives us a sense of the first 30 years or so of the early church, the early group of people that gathered around Jesus after he had died. Now, in the New Testament, there's also a series of letters. These are written by people like Paul the Apostle, and in names like Peter the Apostle, or James, or Jude. So these are people that are named and gathered around Jesus in the early days and then lived to talk about him in letter form. Often written from one person or one group of people to a church or a group of believers in an area. They tell us not so much exactly what people believed, but what happens when they tried to live their belief out in everyday life. They tell us about the problems that occurred in trying to be a Jesus follower in the culture in which they lived. And then there's something called Apocalypse. Now, there's only one full book called the Apocalypse. It's the book we call Revelation. I think most people call it Revelations. And but there are little apocalyptic parts throughout the New Testament as well. The Apocalypse is like a dream vision book. It captures. It's like taking a video and then pulling the lens back in the video of history. And so it looks at history not just in the moment that it happened, but throughout all of history. And it gives sort of an angelic or God's eye view of history. It's a pretty fascinating book and causes all kinds of controversies. Now, these 27 letters and books and history books were all written within a few years of Jesus, within 40 to 75 years of Jesus having walked on the earth. They're written by that first generation and second generation of followers as the individuals who had followed Jesus and knew him personally and knew the early Christians as they were starting to pass away. Sometimes they died because of persecution, and sometimes they just died of normal old age. As they began to pass away, they decided to gather these books together and to really kind of codify what was taking place in this early world. Now, it wasn't immediately that they came up with something they called the New Testament. Phil Yancey has a book called The Bible That Jesus Read. It's a book about the Old Testament because the first 100 years or so of Christianity, the only Bible that people had would have been the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a series of books, not so much letters. There are a few letters in it, but these are songs, books of law, books of history, books of poetry, books of prophecy telling about what God's heart is for the present and for the future. These books are gathered together in a generation after Jesus, and Christians took this Jewish tradition with them into the future. And so the Old Testament was remarkably set, but there were other books that Christians read. And so it became interesting about 120 years or so after Jesus had died. It became interesting to ask the question, so of the bedside reading of early Christians, what's the most important thing? What's the thing that tells us the most truth about Jesus and about the early Christians? And so they began making lists and arguing back and forth, and it took another couple of 100 years, but the 27 books that we have in the New Testament was sealed in, by the end of the 4th century. And there are some differences. There are some Christians in parts of Africa and parts of the Middle East that have a few different books. But for the most part, of the 2.3 billion or so Christians throughout the world, the New Testament is remarkably the same. Now, that New Testament is what they call a canon. Now, not a rocket cannon, but a canon is an old word that means rule or rule stick. And so it's like a guideline that is used then. And so if we want to ask a question about what early Christianity was or what Christians believed, the Bible, the New Testament and the Old Testament, acts as a rule stick to guide people in the way that they should understand what Christianity is or should be. And so that continued, and of course the Bible ends up being one of the most popular books that has ever been produced ever. Now, if you're picking it up for the first time, there's some things that you're going to encounter. Now, if you were to pick up this Gideon's Bible here, and you open it up, you're going to discover that the language in this case is not exactly put in the language that you would speak every day. I have sunk in deep mire, and there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and a flood overflows me. This is part of Psalm 69. Begins with the phrase, "Save me, O God, for the waters have threatened my life." This is poetry. Not everybody reads poetry every day. My favorite is Dr. Seuss, but most people haven't encountered poetry except in school. And so there's going to be some distance between you as a reader and what's in the text to begin with. So one of the great things you can do is to pick a great translation. Now, I've included a link in the web blog here on apilgriminarnia.com that talks about finding your own translation. But I would encourage you, if you're reading the Bible for the first time, to find the translation that you pick up and is the easiest for you to read, the one that's the most engaging and the one that you like the best. If you're a poet, it's going to end up being something like the older King James Version, which is going to sound a lot like Shakespeare's language, but a little bit easier in some cases. So that's a great poet's translation. Another one would be in English, the English Standard Version. If you're looking for something that's easier to read, the New Living Translation is a great translation, or the New Jerusalem Bible is another engaging one. If you're looking for what most people use, it would depend on the kind of church that they go to. But most people in the Protestant world in English were using some form of the New International Version, and still are. It's by far the most popular version, fairly easy to read and pretty accessible, and you can find one new still in the bookstores or multiple copies at a second-hand bookstore or a thrift store. And in the Catholic world, the New Jerusalem Bible is a great option. I would encourage you to actually shop through and pick one that really works for you. If you're actually listening and your first language is another language, especially the Asian language, the East Asian languages, so Korean, Japanese, and the different Chinese translations, they tend to come as more formal and difficult translations. But if you dig around, you can find the one that works for you. So finding a translation is a great way, but it wasn't originally written in English or in Mandarin. It was originally written in Greek. The whole New Testament is written in Greek, and about 95% or 96% of the Old Testament was written in a language called Hebrew. Hebrew was the language of what we now know as the Jewish people, the Hebrew people. These are the people that escaped from Egypt and founded themselves in West Asia, the people called Israel. And there's also a little bit of the Old Testament in the language of Aramaic. And Aramaic was the colonial language for a period when much of the Old Testament was either finished up or gathered together. So Aramaic became the language that many Jews spoke at the time of Jesus. So as Jesus was walking around in his world in West Asia, right on the Mediterranean Sea, he would have been speaking for the most part Aramaic to one another. And then in the temple or the synagogues, they would have been reading the scriptures in Hebrew. And some of the teaching would have been in Hebrew. And Jewish boys and some Jewish girls would have been learning Hebrew and Aramaic as they grew up. But because they were part of a much larger world, the Roman Empire, what sometimes we call the Greco-Roman world, they also learned the language Greek. A few might have learned Latin. The Apostle Paul probably knew some Latin, and perhaps a writer like Luke, or the writer of the Hebrews, knew some Latin. But for the most part, even though it was the Roman Empire and Latin was the official language, the language that most people spoke outside of Rome was Greek, and sometimes even in Rome. Greek was accessible, people understood it, and most people spoke it, and it's the way that English works today, how most people in the world are learning English in order to do business or to engage in travel or to engage with the many English-speaking parts of the world. Even though English is more difficult to learn and not the most sensible language for the world to learn, Greek is the same. It wasn't the easiest to learn, but it's the one that most people did learn. And so even though Jesus wandered around speaking Aramaic and reading and writing in Hebrew, he may also have known Greek. Certainly the Apostle Paul and all the writers of the New Testament knew Greek. And they decided at the early stages of writing to one another that the way that Jesus' message was going to get out was not in the language that Jesus actually spoke, the Aramaic language for the Jewish people, but it was going to be translated into Greek and then ultimately into other languages, Latin, Persian, and thousands of languages that we have today. This language question is a bit of a struggle because language never comes on its own. It always comes with a culture. I lived in Japan for a couple of years, learned the Japanese language, but the more I learned about the Japanese language, the more I really knew that I did not know Japanese. I did not know the Japanese language because I wasn't part of the culture, and a lot of their cultural world was bound up in the language. So in the same way, Greek tells us a lot about, the fact that the New Testament is in Greek tells us a lot. The Jewish people lived as a minority in a world that weren't very good at tolerating minorities. A fairly large minority, but still a minority. And they felt a lot of pressure and a lot of tensions. And the New Testament is a story that's told to us within the tensions of a minority, a Jewish minority, living within an occupying force, the Romans, speaking a foreign language, Greek, to do all their trade and to do all the things that had to be done in state, and waiting for a Messiah to come, waiting for a hopeful one, a prophet king to come and to save them, to deliver them out of the pressure that they were feeling, to resolve all those tensions, and to make the world the kind of place that God promises. It's something like what happened with Moses delivering the people of Israel out of Egypt. They were hoping for something like that to come. And Jesus claims to be that one. And the early Christians claim that Jesus was that one. And so the New Testament captures all those difficulties, all those struggles, occupying forces, minorities, racial tensions, language struggles, and a hope for a future that is not coming immediately. And so one of the reasons we spend in New Testament classes, we spend a whole semester. Sometimes people spend years I took 2 degrees in the New Testament trying to understand this world. The reason we spend so much time is because to understand the culture will help us understand the words of the New Testament. And so a typical New Testament class will begin first by looking at the culture. And so we would look at the culture of the Greco-Roman world, so a bit of Greek history with the Roman culture around it, the world in which Jesus and the early apostles lived, but also looking at the Jewish world, because even though the language is Greek and even though the structure of that world is Greek, the heart of the early believers in Jesus was Jewish. They were all Jewish. Jesus never used the word Christianity and was not a Christian. Jesus was a Jew and he died as a Jew. And so learning about Judaism helps us to understand the New Testament world. And it's a fascinating world, it really is. In some ways it shouldn't be that difficult. The words are right there, and yet there's always something there when you dive into the New Testament. There's always something to discover. So I'd encourage you, if you actually want to know the New Testament, to spend some time learning the Old Testament. Christians understand it this way, that Jesus is the Word of God. Jesus is God spoken into reality as a recreated reality. And the whole Bible points towards Jesus. The Old Testament points towards Jesus' coming with hope. And then the New Testament captures the era of Jesus, his life, his works, his teaching, his death, and his resurrection. And then the rest of the New Testament